commence the first session of the 14th NLSIR Samvad Symposium, which is titled Assessing India's Clinical Trial Rules, Developments and Some Festering Concerns for the Healthcare System. The session seeks to address gaps in the regulation of scientific and traditional medicines in India in light of its clinical trial regime. The most recent regulatory development on this front took the form of the New Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules, 2019. However, in their conceptualization and implementation, they have raised several pertinent questions relating to granting and extending of approvals, ensuring safety of participants of clinical research, etc. The panel seeks to examine these pertinent themes to some depth, while simultaneously addressing the shortfalls in the approval regimes of traditional medicines. Thus, with delight, I'd like to invite an expert in healthcare law, Mr. Murli Neelakanthan, to deliver the keynote address for this session. Mr. Murli is currently a principal lawyer at Amicus, and he has a wealth of experience as Global General Counsel at pharmaceutical giants. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Following Justice Bhatt and Dr. Swaminathan was always going to be tough, but I find that it's even more daunting given that I'm on a panel with doctors. I'm of course delighted to be here, but I suspect that I may have been the beneficiary of some nepotism, having been a student here at NLSIU many, many years ago. What you will hear over the next 10 minutes perhaps wasn't what I had prepared last week or 2 weeks ago. Dr. Milind, who's on the panel with us, casually remarked yesterday that a keynote address is expected to address the topic from 30,000 feet. I therefore have some mixed feelings about my debut keynote address. Now that I've set the expectations low, I will turn to the topic of clinical trials in India, and specifically the new Clinical Trial Rules 2019. It's not that India did not have clinical trial rules before 2019. There was a whole schedule in the drugs rules, and clinical trials were conducted in India. In fact, several clinical trial outsourcing organizations, I know it sounds like BPO, and you wouldn't be wrong in thinking of them in that way, including many global ones, were active in India with thousands of applications for trials. But in 2012, to quote Bob Dylan, too many people had died. In 2013, the Supreme Court put a hold on 162 clinical trials. At the same time, the Parliamentary Standing Committee scrutinized the working of the drug regulator, and its report was scathing in its criticism of how drugs had been approved in India. The government, as expected, set up a committee, the Roy Chaudhary Committee, to revise the clinical trial rules. Thankfully, the committee consulted extensively, and the current rules were a result of that process. The new Clinical Trial Rules 2019 incorporate the World Medical Association Declaration of Helsinki, ethical principles for medical research involving human subjects, first declared in 1964 and subsequently amended several times until 2013. The two fundamental ideas underpinning the declaration, as I see it, were science and ethics. There was an acknowledgement that decisions will be taken on the basis of science. And since clinical trials are essentially scientific studies, the results will be evidence and facts. The new clinical trial rules lay out a logical and methodical procedure, as one would expect from science. The rules assume that everyone in the ecosystem making a decision will be led by science, evidence, and facts. Well, science, evidence, and facts are universal, aren't they? So all is well, isn't it? Well, those of you who've been studying jurisprudence will find this exercise interesting. Did the new rules change the behavior and culture of the drug regulator tasked with implementing the rules, the sponsors of the clinical trials, and the doctors conducting the trials? Now, I know Dinesh will be addressing the role of the regulator in greater detail, but lipstick on a pig should bookmark the idea in your head until he speaks and expands on Dr. Swaminathan's thought of the cycle of panic and neglect. There was a recognition in the Helsinki Declaration that progress in medical science required clinical trials, but that these ought to be conducted in an ethical manner. At the heart of this was the relationship between a doctor and a patient, not a scientist and a specimen, not a lab technician and a guinea pig. I digress a little. There have been three noble professions: priests, doctors, and lawyers. Don't take my word for it, look at the law. These three professions enjoy privilege. So what is said to a priest in confession, to a doctor or a lawyer, is secret. Perhaps there is a need to have a safe place, a safe relationship to keep unpleasant truths from society. I don't know. And before some smart aleck is itching to ask why spouses enjoy privilege and what's noble about marriage, after almost 20 years, I'm ashamed to say I don't know. I think of noble professions as requiring a higher standard of ethics and integrity than the wider society to which we belong. The sorry saga of clinical trials in India can be attributed to doctors failing in their duties to patients. Those who participate in clinical trials are referred to as volunteers, and their doctors are referred to as investigators. That should give you a hint of what is to come and what the consequences are. Patients are often desperate and vulnerable and rely entirely on the doctor for advice, especially in India. They believe that the doctor is acting in their best interest at all times. This is what the Helsinki Declaration expects. Patients trust doctors like they trust God. But as Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said, religion is a culture of faith. Science is a culture of doubt. Sadly, the less said about ethics and integrities of Babajis and Godmen, the better. But doctors seem to be giving Babajis a run for their money these days. I won't say anything about lawyers for fear that it might incriminate me. But back to the Helsinki Declaration. Since the rules implement the Helsinki Declaration, we have to ask ourselves if it is just a matter of ensuring compliance by key players. Well, yes, but as you will gather during the panel discussion, there are still deficiencies. The most significant is something that Justice Bhatt mentioned. I frame it as the morality of denying access to knowledge that was obtained in the clinical trial. This knowledge should be shared, and Principle 36 of the Helsinki Declaration mandates it, especially since volunteers risk their lives believing that their altruism would help mankind. And science progresses best when knowledge is shared. Sadly, the data obtained in these trials is treated as a commercial secret. Justice Bhatt alluded to this issue when he spoke about the regime for data exclusivity. I think of it as both immoral and inhuman. A consequence of data exclusivity is that many mistakes will be made and many lives have been lost, all of which are completely avoidable. If only the data was shared, subsequent trials would be safer. We won't be killing people while figuring out how they died, while all the time someone else already knew but wouldn't tell us. You'll hear from other panelists about how the pandemic has tested the system. I'll leave you with this. A ship in port is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. In calm waters, every ship has a good captain. Sadly, you're all familiar with words like Fabiflu, Remdesivir, plasma, itolizumab, tocilizumab, ivermectin, even Coronil, Ayush 64. It doesn't give me any pleasure to tell you that you're most certainly not immune for the consequences of the new clinical trial rules. Those of you on Twitter will know me by my handle, Grumpy Old Man. You should not have expected an uplifting keynote address. I hope that at lunchtime, all you young people will be scared and angry, hungry for change, angry that this is happening around you, and scared that it could be or is happening to you. I assure you that we old people won't be. Ultimately, you will find most old people lament. Some quote Shelley, O world, O life, O time, on whose last steps I climb, trembling at that where I stood before. When will return the glory of your prime? No more, oh, nevermore. Out of the day and night, a joy has taken flight. Fresh spring and summer and winter hoar move my faint heart with grief, but with delight. Oh, more, oh, nevermore. I'll leave you with that thought, Lament of an Old Man. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neelkantan, for your relevant, riveting, and humorous introduction to clinical trials and their international legal principles. We are quite uplifted and curious, but we'd like to assure you this was not due to nepotism. We do not think anyone could have done this job better. We are very grateful to you. I'd like to now invite the moderators and panelists for session 1. Professor Padmavati Manchikanti is a professor at Rajiv Gandhi School of Intellectual Property Law at Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur, and was recently felicitated by the World Intellectual Property Forum as one of India's Powerful Women in Intellectual Property 2021. We are delighted to have Professor Manchikanti moderate session 1. Our next panelist, Dr. Milind Antani, is a surgeon turned lawyer who leads pharma, life sciences, and healthcare practice at Nishit Desai Associates. He has an in-depth practical and technical expertise of Indian drug regulatory landscape. Our third panelist, Mr. Dinesh Thakur, is a public health activist and an expert in pharmaceuticals and drug regulations. He works towards improving the quality of affordable medicines worldwide and has been a recipient of numerous international accolades. Finally, we are also excited to have Mr. Murli Neelkantan join session 1 as a panelist. I welcome you all, and before moving into session 1, I'd like to inform the attendees that you are welcome to send in questions at any point of time during the session using the Q&A function on the call. These questions will be addressed by the panelists when we formally move into the audience question and answer part of the panel. Without further ado, I hand over to you, Professor Padmavati.
Thank you, Sylvie. Good morning to all the panelists. Good morning to the audience. We now start the panel on the session 1, which is on assessing India's clinical trial rules, developments, and some festering concerns. The stage has been set by my co-panelist, Mr. Murli. I would like to now invite Dr. Milind to give his views with respect to the policy as well as the recent work that he has been involved in raising some of the concerns so that they get addressed nationally. Dr. Milind.
Thank you, Professor Padmavati, and many thanks to analysts for having me. You know, whenever I speak in such forums, I always get, I won't call it a bipolar, but there's a confuse because I have possibly two brains, if at all a doctor has a brain and a lawyer has a brain. That having practiced surgery for 14 years and 18 years being a pharma lawyer, you will see a lot of combo effect coming when I talk. And I must compliment Murli, you know, having such a sharp eye who can see from 30,000 feet is it's a commendable job. Thank you, Murli, for touching very crucial, very pertinent, and very important points, I think, when we talk of clinical trials and introduction of drugs in India. Before we really move on to the panel discussions and discussing and interacting questions from Professor Padma as well as you all attendees, I would want to give you a quick download or a brief overview how exactly things really happen, especially in clinical trials. It's going to be more predominant the law side than the medical side. You know, I'm reminded, I'm a huge movie buff, and you will see movies being quoted maybe in next 7-8 minutes that I'm speaking. But there was a movie called Mera Naam Joker, and there was a puzzle which was being sung by the students led by a famous actress, Simi Garewal. That was titar ke do aage titar, titar ke do piche titar. Aage titar, piche titar, bolo kitne titar. The answer was obvious 3, but everybody got confused. And that is what something has happening when it comes to laws for clinical trials in India. Many times you feel you are few feet forward. Maybe it was 2 feet forward and 4 steps backwards. Sometimes it happened just 2 steps forward and 2 steps backward. Then there was absolutely no steps. Everything was standstill during some time. Murli mentioned about Supreme Court judgment, and which changed actually the entire flavor of conduct of trials in India. And of late, I think entire industry is in a way happy that there is something that has come, which was required. And I call this, I think it is a 4 steps forward and maybe 1 or 2 steps backward, because a lot needs to be done. And that is where, many times we were asked, and our clients, when we were approaching, they were approaching us, mainly the sponsor organizations doing clinical trials in India, doing documentation, due diligence of CROs. And many times the statements came. People call me doc, even clients call me doc somehow. The doc, I think they are not regulations, they're strangulations. And that is where I think I want to say, and I'm happy that we have new clinical trial rules, and Murli mentioned there was a whole schedule in the law which was taking care of Schedule Y, but now we have a wonderful a regulation called new clinical device rules, which has elaborated a lot. But what I'm going to talk upon, a lot has been done, but a lot can be done, and a lot needs to be done. When you talk of clinical trials, what really comes to mind is, what is clinical trial? And if we really pick up every statement or a sentence spoken by Dr. Soumya and elaborate and expand and implement, I think there is no need to do entire symposium today. She touched upon every important points that is required today. Before pandemic, nobody knew what clinical trials is. Only thing people knew was what was coming out in press. Itne patients mar gaye, the people in India are guinea pigs, but nobody understood what the clinical trial is. And today, even my driver asked me a few months ago, he said, "Ye clinical trial kya hai? Ye vaccine kab aayegi? Trial kab khatam hoga?" No, that's a positive part, honestly speaking, that people have started realizing that clinical trial is important. But is it really so? And when you talk of things, always drugs, healthcare, there is a combination of words always come to my mind. Whether it is a battle of head and heart, whether it is legal, ethical, if it is unethical, illegal, I firmly believe when there is a combo of doctor and a lawyer comes, that law is head and ethics is heart, and that is where the balance is really missing, the entire thing. There's another combination of what is accessibility and affordability. The drugs which are there are really accessible. Drugs, I'm not going to touch upon affordability part because we are discussing clinical trials today, but accessibility of drug is very important. Then another important thing when you talk of clinical trials, another combination comes is safety and efficacy. Very important point, that any drug which is coming to India or any drug which is being given to the patients in India is really effective. That is the first thing. And if it is effective, at the same time, it is very important to know whether it is safe or not. At the end of the day, patient is paramount. Everything needs to be patient-centric, and why clinical trials happen, why so much of research happens, why so much of development happens, is at the end of the day taking care of the ailments patients are suffering from and giving the best possible medications. And another last thing which has come recently is crisis and opportunity. Crisis brings opportunity. That's what people said, that the pandemic was a crisis, is a crisis, I'm sorry, and will be a mild crisis for next 1 year or so. But it has brought a lot of opportunities. But is that opportunity grabbed? Have we, when I say we, it is not only regulator, it is we, the citizen of India, the regulators, politicians, everybody are working on that opportunity, because it is said that opportunity never knocks your door. You have to create an opportunity, and unfortunately, the opportunity to provide access of new drugs, important drugs, and maybe some pandemic is going to come after a few years for sure. Science says that. Will this crisis that has given us the opportunity is going to make us prepare for that? And that is where the law comes into picture. What is law? Law is primarily a facilitator to provide quality. Whether it is a traffic law, whether it is a drug law, end of the day, what you look is quality. Whatever that has been done, I'm now focusing only on the health side and the drug side, that whatever that is being done, is quality adequate or not? And that is where, the real challenge comes, that there are many laws, so many regulations, and clinical trials, as Murli mentioned, has seen ups and downs. Dr. Soumya also mentioned a lot of ups and downs going on, but she was very right. Why this happened? Maybe situations demanded, the situations warranted that. And the new clinical trial rules that we are going to discuss during next panel and second half of the day also, is something that has really pushed. Entire industry has welcomed, no question about it. But it is said that whenever a law needs to be implemented, many times questions asked, and I always tell them that compliance is key, period. There is a very famous line that if anybody who feels compliance is expensive, try non-compliance once. The famous Attorney General of US once said that. That is why I always believe that when there is a law, and I'm talking with reference to clinical, it is always said that something must be done, something should be done, something is nice to do, and something is okay if you do it. And there are some things you may not do it. I'm not saying not becoming non-compliant, but sometimes we end up giving a lot of emphasis, ignoring what must be done. And that is where law comes into picture. Now I'll just touch upon where exactly the new clinical trials rules are there. Wonderful regulations that was absolute need of the hour, a lot of confusions, and lawyers, being a lawyer, I love gray color. Any lawyer would love gray color, because when there is a gray ambiguity, people need lawyers. But when it comes to clinical trial, and as I mentioned, it is all about giving a quality. You cannot have gray areas. That is what my concern is, and that is what I think the today's topic, that we need to talk about concerns and what best can happen. So the biggest challenge today I personally see is that there are significant ambiguities in clinical trial rules. People have started talking about clinical trials because of pandemic, the way approvals have come, emergency use authorization, restricted emergency use authorization. These have become jargons, and every Tom, Dick, I'm sorry to use this word, but everybody talks about this. A lot of people ask me, what is EUA? And honestly, I don't have an answer from India perspective. And I'm sure fellow panelists also will agree that what is EUA in other countries like US and what is EUA in India, I think it's a different ball game. But that is where I think the role of regulator providing accessibility possibly has come into picture. And possibly, I won't call it a jumping the guns, but the speed really played role, But point is it speedy or is it hasty? Because the moment the line between being hasty and being speedy is getting blurred, the quality is going to get hampered. That is where I think the ambiguity which is there in the new clinical trials rules. Recently, there was a notification or a circular that India regulators have allowed vaccines developed in X countries to be imported, and corporates can import. It's a one paragraph notification or a circular, provided they follow 1, 2, 3. Now that 1, 2, 3 is a challenge. Technically, the timeline to get import license is 9 months under law. Under clinical trial rules also, it is mentioned. They said it will happen in three days. I don't know when you're talking about vaccine, and why it is very important that vaccine per se is a new drug. Because all other pharmaceutical products are given to treat the patient. I use so many medications, being an ENT surgeon for 15 years, to treat something. Whereas vaccine is given to prevent something. So pharmaceutical product is given to a diseased person, vaccine is given to a normal person. That is where the entire concept of making them new drug requiring certain quality parameters to be followed before it is given to patients were there. But yes, there is a need, and there is a very positive point, but are we doing something adequate? And that is where my only worry, and I will just take 2 minutes, that there are so many issues on methodology of approvals. There is a mention of certain countries which has not yet officially come. I'm referring to Rule 75 7.1 of new clinical trial rules, where there is something interpretational issues. Rule 75.7 is the most important thing when clinical trials are not required. And I tell you, when it came for the first time, my team and I was a part of an organization, we took 3-4 days to even decide. And ultimately it was decided, let us think how the regulator is interpreting this. It is 1 or 2 and 3 and 4. So it is 1 or 1, 1 or 2 and 3 and 4, or it is 1 or 2, 3, 4. And entire perspective of that provision changes. The regulator's interpretation, I personally, being a lawyer and a doctor, don't agree to that at all. But if you have an approval for some particular product outside specified countries which are notified, they can be given subject to certain trials being done in India. However, so these are certain gray areas. Another important point when it comes to clinical trial is being independent. The problem is possibly sometimes left hand doesn't know what right hand is doing. And that also was very nicely touched upon by Dr. Soumya, that being independent as well as implementation, these are the two most important things possibly can be taken care of. And the last is the implementation of rules has become very fragmented. We need to work on certain things because SEC, Subject Expert Committee, is the most important body in the clinical trials rules implementation. But do we have the right person doing the right job? Do they really understand what they are talking? Do they understand what has come on their plate? So something on formation of the proper Subject Expert Committee is going to play a role. And I'll just end by touching the last point. Yes, India needed drugs in pandemic. It was a desperate situation. Vaccines came, confusion, restricted use authorization, restricted emergency use authorization. One was Covaxin, second was Covishield. Whether informed consent is required, so everybody was in phase 3 trial. Are we subjecting the entire population to the risk purely from quality point of view? Yes, there was a need. Hopefully nothing happened. Something could have happened. The antibiotics overuse, misuse, abuse, like Murli rightly mentioned about so many products, remdesivir, tocilizumab, are actually not indicated for this particular infection. They are being used. Are they off-label use, which are not permissible in India? Has government or regulator done something on that? Is there something proper guidance? You keep on seeing guidance floating around on WhatsApp University, which is right, wrong, fake. Nobody knows. That is a confusion. So my only point is what has happened recently on getting such approvals because there was an absolute need for the population of India should not become precedences in future. And I really hope that people do consider this and take care, because I don't want to see people suffering from hepatic problems, renal problems because of absolute overuse, abuse of antibiotics, which are given to even mildest form of coronavirus. Of course, it is not only doctors, patients also insisted. I know one of my friends in Gujarat, I asked him, why you're using so much? So one patient's related came, why don't you give remdesivir? I said, it is not required. He said, if this patient dies, I'm going to take you to court. Why don't you give it? So these are the situations that are happening. So most important point I just wanted to cover up is there is an importance to create a proper communication, effective communication, creating the awareness about what are the rules, how drugs are effective, how they can provide quality to the entire population at large, and come to some conclusion. And it's very rightly said, and I firmly say that as I started, the laws are changing. Laws are changing on a positive side, on a better side. They are on the right track. But only thing I just want to say that please differentiate and have the law, the line between the speed and the haste very thick. It is good to have speed, but it is dangerous to have haste. And I just want to say that the law is there, clinical trial rules are extremely well, but follow them, implement them. And though everything is going very positive, I'm just, my favorite statement, it is said that at the end of the tunnel, always there is a light. We love it. My dad told me, my brother told me, I possibly told my son also. So at the end of the tunnel, always there is a light, but be careful. It could be of a coming vehicle. So take these laws with a very serious things, follow it, implement it, and I'm sure we are going to have better products which are going to help the mankind in India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Milind, for this walking us through. I think Murli took us to a poetic context, and you started with the context of a bit of a nuance into films. And very rightly, you put the context of quality, compliance, and the construction of the SEC, and touching upon 75(7) of the rules. Without taking much time, I now invite Mr. Dinesh Thakur, who is the public health advisor and expert in the pharmaceutical area regulation. Please come forward, Mr. Dinesh. I know you've been waiting. He is now coming from the East Coast of the US. So kindly please enlighten the audience on the text of the regulation, and also talk about the administrative part of the entire state system in relation to the current scenario that we are facing. Yeah, Mr. Dinesh Thakur. Yes, yes, we can.
All right. Thank you, Professor Padmavati. I have been given about 5 to 7 minutes, and I'm going to try and stick to my time. It's just past 2 a.m. in the morning here, so if I'm a little groggy, please forgive me. I think Murali actually, set the right context for the keynote by staying at the 30,000 foot level. I am actually going to go down to the ground level, and I'm going to take a contrarian point of view to what Dr. Milind and Tani said. Because as somebody who works as an activist, I find the regulation to be absolutely abominable. And I will tell you why. Murli made a few references to how things work today. Among the participants, in the list of participants that I scrolled through, I saw a number of doctors, and I'm assuming there are a number of law students as well who are in the audience. And because time is short and I want to keep time for discussion later on, let me just take 2 specific instances and point out to you how not to write a regulation, how not to write law which creates problems for other people when they go ahead and implement it. And the reason I want to do this is because you, the students of law who are listening today, you are going to be responsible for fixing this mess when we go forward. And it's important for you to know why that is important, right? These rules, the new drugs and clinical trial rules, resulted as a consequence of the Indian Supreme Court mandate to go back and look at the way that we conduct our clinical studies. That Supreme Court judgment basically gave a mandate to a committee to write these rules. Now, many of the people who actually write these rules don't necessarily understand how the system works. So let me just take you to the second schedule of the new drugs and clinical trial rules. It says C rules 2021, 75, 80, and 90. And I'm going to scroll down to the later part of this and look at what is called an accelerated approval process. Now, Milind and Tani talked about the fact that, we love to appropriate terminology that doesn't exist in our law. Emergency approval, emergency use authorization does not exist in Indian law. But look how easily we use it. the provision for approval of the drugs that you're running around today, the favipiravir, the itolizumab, were given under what is called the accelerated approval process that is defined in this law. And you know what that definition actually calls for? It calls for it says that the regulator can actually provide accelerated approval if remarkable efficacy is observed in with a defined dose in phase 2 study. Now, let's understand this. When you write a regulation of this nature and use words like remarkable efficacy, now ask a lawyer to interpret that. What does that mean in the context of what we are doing? The 2 drugs that are on the market today that were approved by the Drugs Controller General of India, favipiravir and itolizumab, were approved based on shoddy, horrible clinical trials that have no evidence that they actually work. And Murali will back me up on this. The number of patients that were enrolled in those studies and the way that those approvals were given are a laughingstock. It's no better than Coronel. What Patanjali Ayurveda did with their shoddy clinical trial that they actually did at the hospital in Jaipur. But the fact remains is that today we see lines of people standing outside medical stores of these companies, potentially infecting themselves because they're not even wearing a mask and there's no social distancing. Will somebody ask them how many infections are actually happening because relatives of people who are already infected are running around trying to source, itolizumab and favipiravir? Are we counting the number of fatalities that are happening in that area? The reason I'm saying this is because the law is really poorly written. And it's incumbent on you, the students of law, when you look at a poorly drafted regulation of this nature, to fix it in the future if you do get a chance. And don't write law like this. To give people, a bureaucrat, an ability to use loosely defined terminology like remarkable efficacy to approve drugs that have absolutely no therapeutic efficacy. So that's one part of it. I think I've used about 2.5 minutes. The other 2.5 minutes, I'm going to focus on systems. How do you know that when you design a clinical study, when a manufacturer figures out that they want to design a clinical study to prove the efficacy of their drug, how do you know that study is sound? The way it happens is that you go and register that study in what is called the Clinical Trial Registry of India. There is a system out there where you actually go in and you specify your protocol. You say that I'm going to be testing this drug, this potential drug candidate, on patients that qualify certain criteria, right? You say that I want to be looking at, adults potentially over 21 years of age, potentially not looking at, elderly people above 65 years of age. I don't want any comorbidities in it. But most importantly, statistically, you figure out how many patients do you need to enroll into that study in order to prove a statistical significance. What is happening in India today is that there is absolutely no control over that. Pharma companies go and register these things. And the best example I can give you is, Patanjali Ayurveda was promoting the fact that Coronel was somehow WHO approved. That was what was said on a stage publicly along with the health minister of India. And there was no consequence for that. Systems need fixing. The clinical trial registry does not work. And it gives people, pharma companies, a leeway to go ahead and do this kind of nonsense, go out there and make claims that the drug actually works, but it doesn't. There is no clinical evidence for it. And as Milind Antani said, hide behind opacity. Not even tell the people of India who are the people who are recommending the approval of that drug. It took 6 months or potentially 4 months to try and get membership of the subject expert committee who approved these drugs out in the open. Is that a state secret? I'll stop now. I'm sure there'll be questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dinesh. I think you've really flagged some very, very important concerns, touching on the aspect of evidence-based and also bringing in a lot of transparency and reflecting on the CTRI itself. We will come back to the Q&A session. Mr. Neelakantan, any thoughts on this panel taking forward from your keynote?
I think both Milind and Dinesh have made the points that take the discussion forward. My own thinking was that remarkably, even though we haven't coordinated this, what Justice Bhatt said, what Dr. Swaminathan said, and what Milind and Dinesh and I have been saying, seem to all make sense together. So I suspect that this can't be a coincidence. There must be some truths there. But let's take some of the questions that we have.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to add my 2 cents into it in terms of the pharmacovigilance, where that is going to fray, considering we are now looking at phase 3, unimaginable in the world on such a large scale. So that's been a bit of my concern. I don't work on vaccines, but my work on the recombinant, the drugs and that area, I was focusing on. So this aspect of pharmacovigilance that the new drug clinical trial rules talk about, I really do not know what is the governance framework for the coordination between the different central level, state level, and the public health safety system itself reacting to that entire context of it. Because going forward, this is going to bring, I believe, build the trust. If we need to build good trust into the future of such vaccines, we need to keep in sight the pharmacovigilance part, which not much is being talked on in the current context. And that's a deep concern that I have. So I will not take much time, and I will now invite each of the panelists with a few questions, which are not only of concern to all of us on the panel, but I think I do see that as a general public concern itself. I'll first maybe go with Dinesh, because Dinesh is being, is coming at a time when, we don't want to hold him up for too long. So, Mr. Dinesh, how do you really look at the aspect of lack of access of data? You mentioned about CTRI, and very rightly, this lack of access of data has a ramification, one from the research standpoint, another from the building faith in the system. So how do you see this in terms of improvement of the healthcare, not only in the context of India, but I think your experience from the global context itself?
Yeah. So listen, so collection of metrics that are important for policy making should not be under the purview of the political leadership. It's plain and simple. I'll just give you a simple example. Like every second Friday, the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually puts out the jobs data, meaning, how many people actually got jobs and, what happened to them in this country where I live. That data, by law, they can't even share that information with the President of the United States an hour before the data goes out. Today, NSSO in India, that's responsible for collecting, information around economic and health metrics, it, like every other institution, is under the pressure of the political, sort of class. We can't even count deaths properly today. I mean, there's a great sort of a discussion that the mathematician Murad Banaji had with Karan Thapar 2 days ago, where they've started looking at the fact that, do we really understand how many people are dying? Because the government keeps saying that we only have so many deaths, but if you look at the number of cremations that are happening, the number of burials that are happening, the overflowing of the capacity of burial and cremation grounds, how do you reconcile those two things? And if you don't have proper information, how do you make policy? Do we have a national act down? Do we have more sort of targeted sort of containment measures where we believe that there is an increasing community spread? We don't have data. We're suppressing data. And if you suppress data, how do you make decisions? So going back to the question you're asking, making policy without the benefit of actually sound data is foolish, because it doesn't mean anything. And I think that it's high time now for us to be able to separate out NSSO and make it independent, not subject to the whims and fancies of the political leadership, whether the state or the national level.
I think, Professor Padma, I think you are muted. You are muted.
Go ahead.
No, I think I did not hear you. You are muted.
Oh, am I muted? Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear.
Okay. Just one more question to Mr. Dinesh is that how do you see, when you're seeing it from the global perspective, in the United States vis-a-vis India, Dr. Swaminathan, in the earlier, she mentioned about that new variants are coming up, and what kind of global cooperation do you see in the midst of this pandemic, if you look at the regulatory authorities, and what's current going on their thoughts, on their mindsets?
So if you think about it, right, I think that China actually put out the sequence of the first sequenced virus strain as soon as they could find out. That within 24 hours, Moderna actually designed the vaccine for it, right? There is a platform and a forum to share that kind of information, the International Genomic Platform. UK was sequencing more of the B167 variant and telling us the characteristics of that particular variant based on the number of people who travel from India into the UK than we got from our own INSACOG, right? The point here is not that there aren't platforms. International platforms for cooperations exist. The question is, are we doing our part? Are we doing our part in actually sequencing, the variants that we are seeing within our own country? Are we putting the information that we have out there so that people can learn about it? I mean, how does it feel to say that the UK is telling us, based on sequencing of 70 travelers that went from India into the UK, the infection, the infectivity and transmissibility of the B167 variant, where RNCOG is still can't give us that information.
Absolutely, I do agree with you.
I think you're still on mute, Professor Padmavathy. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely. I do agree. There's absolute lack of, I would say, we need to give in our bit into the entire science of it, and urgent information required to tackle this and mitigate the entire spread that we have, which is now just not on the Indian end, but it's actually moving overseas.
Yes.
Thank you. I think that is very, very, very relevant. And this is, I think also, hopefully, this will be also looked at very serious, in a serious context in the forthcoming sessions that this Samvad is involved with. And I think that is something that I would also echo from Honorable Justice Ravindra Bhat. He mentioned about the aspect of the lack of access to data. And this is something which is very shocking. If you look at it, even from the world end, of course, I do see some cooperation now, but with the technological prowess that we have, somewhere we do not have, we do have gaps in this entire access to data. So at the world level, if you can quickly comment on what should be the structure where you can have seamless information being accessed, because today it's just not about the scientists. We need even maybe the doctors also to be accessing that information, in a pandemic like this, which is day-to-day things are changing at such a rapid level.
I think that it's important to curate data, right? When you make policy, for example, when the WHO puts out its treatment guidelines, it goes through a review process, right? There are people who look at that data, decide what it means before formulating specific guidelines that ought to be followed. I think data sharing is one aspect of it. The larger issue is, do we have the mechanisms, the system, the expertise to be able to, sort of understand what that data means, curate that data? I mean, I'll just give you a very simple example. Just about 2 weeks ago, both the WHO and the CDC have now put out specific guidelines around how the transmission happens. Initially, we thought that the virus spread with heavy droplets and when we speak in a certain distance. Now we have more data that talks about aerosol-based transmission. That had to be reviewed by people, understood what it really means, and the mask guidance that was updated was based on that understanding, right? So that curation of data, that understanding of data is extremely important. On other hand, our situation, if you look at the guidelines that the ICMR issued, treatment guidelines on April 21st, which have been revised last week again, on April 21st, our ICMR guidelines still had hydroxychloroquine as a potential treatment option. Now, what does it say about our curation process then? So that is the point I'm trying to make. Collecting data is one aspect of it, but having the ability to think about it and develop a cohesive public health message is more important.
Top brass, I would believe, absolutely cohesive information and the curation of the data. So I'll now move to the next panelist, Dr. Milind. A few thoughts that if you could share on what should be the kind of coordination that we need to see from the end of DCGI to CDCSO to at the state level regulatory system. Certainly there's something which has gone adversely in the entire thing, but what do you perceive in the current pandemic that we are in? What kind of coordination would you really look forward?
Okay, I think, Dinesh very rightly pointed out, and he expressed very genuine concerns, and whether it is a curating data or implementing, whatever he said that is happening is because there is no coordination. If you ask me what can be done, I said there is no coordination, honestly speaking. Let me talk first about the present pandemic, and I will go overall in general. That primarily, health is considered to be a state subject in India constitutionally. And that is where many a times confusion has happened. Let us take classic example of vaccination drive. I being a doctor also is confused, being lawyer I'm angry. Let me tell you that way. Is one time, and state is not procuring vaccines is one thing. That is what the people at large know, that hey, there is, I'm in Mumbai and huge shortage of vaccines for a city like Mumbai. Why? Suddenly a notification or something came that come 1st May and we are going to start vaccination for 18 to 45 years started. But state will procure 50%, state and private sector will procure 50%, and center would procure remaining 50%. Now, what is this 50% state will procure? What is that private sector? Huge disjoint in how it is going to happen. On 30th of April, I wanted my son who's 25 to get inoculated. I went to COVID site and I was searching. There is no center available. So I called my friend in Gujarat, where I was a surgeon, whose hospital was, I'm sorry, I'm slightly digressing, but it's very important purely from coordination point of view. And she called me, Milind, I have received a circular yesterday, which was 29th, that please finish all your vaccine vials by tomorrow evening, 6 p.m. Because from 1st of May onward, your institution, your hospital will not be allowed to give any vaccination. She had about 150 doses. She was lost. So why don't you check? Because possibly I tried to check, same thing happened in Mumbai. Every private setup was asked to stop vaccinating from May 1, exhaust your stock. And that is how, everybody started rushing. They called people. I have a friend whose wife is with Walgreens, Dinesh, and she was telling me how vaccination is managed, that they are given communicate, they are thoroughly communicated that if at all you see there is a possibility of surplus vaccine at the end of the day, please call people from other Walgreens or somebody known to you who are qualifying. So they call to their setup and give them vaccine, so there is no wastage. Interestingly, today there is no vaccine available when there was an average wastage of 6.2% in the first vaccination drive, which is pathetic. And that happened mainly because of the, I won't say the lack of coordination, no coordination. Center did not know what state is doing. State did not know what center is on. Today, I'm still surprised that every state is asking center to give oxygen. Every state is asking center to give vaccines. On the other side, when it started earlier, they said, we will manage because health is a state subject. So, there needs to be some kind of coordination. That is number one, purely on patient side. Same thing Dinesh also mentioned about drugs being approved, supplied. There was a long queues for remdesivir for, I don't know who is responsible, whether the people were standing on a queue were actually the relatives of the patients or not is a big question mark. I know the hard story behind that. I don't want to discuss upon that, who was standing on the queue. But at the same time, I receive a phone call from my support staff in the office, whose wife was admitted, and Dinesh, you'll be shocked to hear this. I received a phone call on 10th day when patient was admitted, stabilized, oxygen 97, 98, low-grade fever of 99, and he calls me, doc, because any health problem, I am there. Can you manage remdesivir? Meku, why? My wife is admitted. Unless I give remdesivir, she is going to die, I am told. Then it was 10th day, and they were demanding remdesivir, where all parameters were normal. C-reactive was hardly 15, D-dimer was just 700 or so. Then I took tough time to explain to him that remdesivir is not at all required. But no, doctor has asked for it. So my point is, another coordinated efforts that we need is, end of the day, regulators need to do a lot of awareness programs. Because unless it comes from horse's mouth, we see, like for example, Dinesh mentioned about guidelines coming from ICMR, it got changed, but previously it doesn't get changed. So even at medical level on WhatsApp, I'm a part of my batch group of medical college. And I'm there not as a doctor, as a lawyer. So many times they keep on sending, I have got two guidelines apart 2 days. New guideline doesn't say that previous guideline is no longer existing. So what should we follow? So these are the things which really play a role. And the third most important coordination program, I won't call it a coordination, but very important thing is on subject expert committee. I have gone through as a process, my entire team, and I always go through, I'm sure Murli will see that you always read SEC minutes. That is where you get something, and we are not getting anything, honestly speaking. Every time I'm reading SEC minutes, I get confused. Like I use the word restricted emergency use authorization, EUA, accelerated. If you read the minutes, all these terms are used where there is nothing provided in the law, as Dinesh very rightly mentioned. And my worry is, when you talk of quality, the rules what we are discussing today is for quality and efficacy and safety. Is it really going to happen? That is my only worry, is that this should not become precedences in future. It's a huge alarming thing. And the most important thing which I have observed, forget about pandemic, is even one officer in FDA, which is CDSCO in India, doesn't know what other FDA officer is talking on the same topic. Murli will definitely agree to me that there is a difference of opinion. And there's so many things, like as I mentioned about Rule 75(7), most confusing rule according to me. I wrote myself just to clarify, and we got clarification. We got two clarifications from the same office, which are contradicting each other. So proper awareness and training at officer level, which are coordinated, then comes state and central FDA issues, because there is a thick line. Manufacturing, distribution is state, and clinical trials, import and medical devices is center. So there is a thick line, but again, everybody is jumping on somebody else's scope very fast. And that is because of the coordination. So my take is, yes, huge lack of coordination, and some process needs to be followed. Otherwise, there's going to be not mess, it's going to be a chaos. That's from my side.
On policy, you must be seeing a serious, a gap at this point of time when it comes to the current state of implementation. Another thing which we lead to is the aspect of compensation and insurance. So how do you really see this in the framework of, obviously, one is the, even prior to that is the aspect of patient safety and things like that, which are already under a huge, question in terms of, even I hear as a person, like you mentioned rightly, remdesivir on one end, and then all the different, the repertoire of drugs, as though, this is a battery of drugs you can just pull out from, a box and just administer. That's one aspect of it. But then what are we really looking at from the context of, insurance and compensation in future, which now, of course, not everyone is looking at grappling with the current getting the people out of the hospital or getting the people into the hospital. But this context of compensation insurance, how do you see going forward?
Yeah. So I'll break this into two parts. And I also want Murli also to touch upon this when he discusses. See, the compensation for clinical trials and compensations generally, let me touch upon that. Insurance part is very simple when it comes to clinical trials. Now, there were compensation guidelines, there was compensation mechanism, and the nosedive that really happened was because of the 20 notifications that came in the span of 8 days post Supreme Court ruling of Swasthadhikar Manch matter. And suddenly the India, which was considered to be the hub for conducting clinical trials due to multiple advantages, cost arbitrage, skill, and advanced hospitals, and of course, easy recruitment of subjects, suddenly took nosedive. And the only reason for that, because I work more for sponsors, only reason was the compensation provision in the law at that time. And slowly it evolved, and now there is some, I won't call it a comfort, but there is some proper mechanism. The new clinical trial rules have defined how compensation can happen, what is the process. I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty. But there are two ways compensation can come. One, interestingly, I'm just reading verbatim, it gives medical management until the subject recovers or until it is determined that the cause of the injury is not related to the trial, whichever is earlier. So one mechanism is patient or a subject needs to be compensated for medical management due to ABC reasons, unless it is proved was because of the trial. This is such a, it's very difficult to interpret, honestly speaking. The doctor in me says it is impossible to manage unless, but by the time it gets proved, patient would have been discharged, or unfortunately, patient would have been, patient would not have survived because of complications. And second provision is compensation is given either for severe adverse reaction or injury or death. There is a formula prescribed, you clear it goes to 44 lakhs or I think 70 or 78 lakhs or something, considering 16 years and something like that. So there is a mechanism for that. But the problem is in compensation, purely from law point of view, I would like to just touch upon who compensates. Earlier, there was a confusion, whether it is CRO, whether it is a hospital, whether it is doctor, or whether it is a sponsor. Then came the law, come what may, sponsor will compensate the patient for injury or death. And there was a line also mentioned in the informed consent form as per the law. Now that led to a lot of confusion and ambiguity and serious concern. Even today, though there is a strict mechanism, there is a clear-cut formula. You can't, this, And unfortunately, formula also is a very vague formula. Earlier, they used the formula which was used to compensate for accident victims under that law. Whether that can justify the same thing for injury because of clinical trials. Another thing that came on compensation, we have done a lot of work on representing client, representing CROs, and sometimes representing patient's body also. It was, of course, on medical device. That where do you draw a line? Stage 4 cancer patient undergoing a trial for a drug for oncology dies. It could be because of the progression of the disease, or it could be because of the drug. That is where the protocol comes. And that is why, being a lawyer, and I'm sure Murli will agree with me, in compensation situation, the most important element is the contract. Whatever contract that is there between sponsor and CRO and hospital and investigator is going to play a role. Earlier, I have seen years ago, there was a quadripartite agreement with sponsor, clinical trial organization, institution, and investigator, all four as a party. Then things changed. It was MSA, which is Master Service Agreement between sponsor and CRO would have back-to-back clinical trial agreement between clinical CRO and institution. We received few queries on compensation from investigator to sponsor, hell with CRO, I'm using the verbatim word, hell with CRO, can you compensate me so that I can give it to patient? So a lot of things are changing. So my personal take is, though there is an absolute formula for deciding the quantum, DCGI office plays role, ethics committee plays role, investigator plays role. There are examples where even after undertaking from a patient's relative on deciding good faith compensation, after 1 month, a notice comes that you have to increase your compensation amount by 125%. Why that happened, nobody knows. But such things keep on happening. So entering into a contract plays very important role. And on insurance today, what we have seen that most of the global clinical trial sponsors are taking insurance coverage of that trial. However, even local trials also sponsors do take clinical trial insurance, but there is a caveat or a proviso that it would not cover any claims arising out of the negligent act or some act on the part of institution or CRO. For doctors, till some years ago, their professional, like I had a professional indemnity insurance, which did not mention clearly that you will not be compensated for any claims arising out of claims of your participation as an investigator into clinical trials. Many policies in professional indemnity insurance still include these lines. So that is where I think the entire, I'm going back to contract, and that is where the indemnity provision plays role. I don't want to go much into it, but everybody is hearing why global vaccines are not coming to India because it is ignore WhatsApp University. Some nonsense is going on a lot of things. But possibly the deadlock, I hope it gets resolved fast, is on the indemnification. Companies want government to indemnify for any claims arising out of adverse reaction of drug. I'm not sure whether government will fully agree to this. This is still being debated. Dinesh possibly would know more than what I know. But this is where I think the entire compensation mechanism is going to play a role. And since you mentioned about pandemic, unless some drastic action points taken for the benefit of patients, like for example, not patients, the population, having vaccine is paramount. Today morning, the mayor of Mumbai said that give me vaccine, I will finish vaccination of entire Mumbai in 48 hours. It is doable. It is absolutely doable, provided we have vaccines. But the challenge is why it is not happening. So I think compensation is there, but how indemnification and how contracts play a role is going to decide on compensation. That's what I thought I will just discuss here.
I think for that elaborate note on what are the challenges that we are facing and what should be the way forward. I will now invite Murli to Mr. Neelakantan to give us a thought into this often checked word on restricted emergency use that we are talking about, the approval system. How do you really look at it from the evidence-based approaches, which is what the entire drug regulatory system, edifice stands on? So, any reaction to that, Murli?
I will, but I just wanted to add something to what Milind just said.
Yes. Yeah.
One is that on compensation, we have a statement from the minister that the total compensation paid in the last 12 years is 25 crores. So clearly that system is not working well. Secondly, the text of the rules relating to compensation is something I discussed with Professor Roy Chaudhary, the author of these rules. And I tried to explain to him that injury related to a trial is different from injury caused by a trial. To him, somehow, it was not very persuasive. But I see this as a real issue. And we're seeing the consequences of that with the adverse events following immunization for the vaccines, where effectively the government is saying nobody died as a result of the vaccines. They were all unrelated. And to the extent they have admitted to a few deaths, those are minuscule and they're quite recent. Although the vaccination has been happening and clinical trials for the vaccines have been happening for more than 6 months now. So there is a real issue with how it is drafted, how it's implemented. And finally, one of the myths, I think, is that health is a state subject. Well, it is, except that I would recommend everybody looks at Schedule 7, List 3, Entry 29. And that relates to infectious diseases. So the pandemic really is not an issue of states figuring it out. It is really an aspect of cooperative federalism. So to leave it to the states for whatever reason, on the basis that health is a state subject, is just a misreading of the Constitution. So those are the 3 points I wanted to make there. But on the issue of why is it that we have it and what it means, there is a reason for an accelerated approval. And there are provisions, as Dinesh mentioned, for accelerated approvals. But you have to think of them slightly differently. What is being accelerated is not the science. What is being accelerated is really the process of approval. Sadly, what we are seeing is the acceleration of something that can't be accelerated. Now, why is it that there was accelerated approvals necessary? There is a very human and moral reason to avoid unnecessary trials. But whether a trial is necessary or not is really a decision to be based on science, evidence, and data. So there is a rationale for fast-tracking approvals. Sadly, the regulator has been completely opaque about the basis for its decisions. What could have been done better? Let's contrast this with the US FDA. It issued a detailed document with all the data on the vaccine trials. I mean, it was just a delight to read how they had really presented that data. They had an 8-hour hearing, which was live streamed. So we could all observe what it is that was being discussed, what questions were being asked, what were these concerns, how they were addressed. And subsequently, a 40-page document which lists the restrictions for the use of these vaccines. Now, what did India do? We just borrowed terms, as Dinesh said, which are completely alien to the CT rules. And that befuddled everyone. The SEC didn't know what it meant. The ICMR didn't know what it meant. Even the applicants for the approvals didn't know what it meant. So if you go back and read the statements by both Serum and Bharat Biotech, it is very clear they didn't know what it meant either. My only explanation, I said it in January, was someone in government is a fan of politics in the English language, a wonderful essay by George Orwell, where he talks about using these words that nobody understands. And the consequence of this is that in January, we didn't know if Covaxin was still in clinical trials or not. If you look at the CTRI website, it says that the clinical trial is still on. In January, the Bharat Biotech told us that they would be releasing phase 3 data in a few weeks. We are now in May, and we still haven't seen the phase 3 data. So what evidence was used, we don't know. If phase 3 data was not available, then on what basis was any form of approval given? What are the restricted uses? And what is an emergency? Is it everybody getting a vaccine because the pandemic is an emergency? That is not how the US treats emergency use authorization. You can't use something just because it's an emergency. By that logic, Dinesh, HCQS is used because there is an emergency, or Coronil is used because there's an emergency, or Ayush 64 is used because there's an emergency. That is sadly the view that the Indian regulator has taken. So I'm extremely concerned with using terms that nobody understands. Dinesh referred to remarkable efficacy. I understand, it's language that's completely avoidable, has absolutely no way of describing what is to be done or what it means to a lawyer. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is, if all of these drugs show remarkable efficacy, and I'm assuming they have some data that shows remarkable efficacy, and that's why we don't have full clinical trials before they're approved, why is it that no other country is using them? Why is it that no other country in the world is recommending itolizumab? Why is it that there is no shortage of remdesivir elsewhere in the world? Do they not see the evidence? Do they not see the scientific data? Well, clearly they do and we don't. The drug regulator really has been caught out in the last 12 months. And I go back to the analogy of the ship and its captain. The ship is in choppy waters and the captain's lack of skills is being exposed. So I really don't have a good answer except to say that we're in deep trouble.
Already worrisome situation, absolutely. Just to take on that a little further, this aspect of vaccines is one aspect of it. Then there is also the new uses context of the NDCT, rules. How do you really see this in the context of availability of trial information, and where is the wherewithal and efficacy data? Safety is one part of it, certainly, but we don't have really efficacy data either also, which is like rampant misuse maybe, Can you just reflect a little bit on that?
The definition of new drugs is quite interesting. And I'm actually happy that somebody thought of it in that way. So, for example, in the case of, let's take remdesivir, it's currently an intravenous product, but if someone came up with an oral pill, then it would clearly be a new drug. And it makes sense that you have a full clinical trial. I'm not a doctor, and Milind will probably help me out here, that it may be the same chemical, but injecting it is very different from swallowing it. The PK characteristics of injection versus digestion is going to be very, very different. And so I'm happy that the new clinical trial rules think of new uses for existing drugs in the same way as new drugs. So in that sense, it is something that we needed desperately. Then what happened? We added another little bit of legislation there with the fixed dose combinations. And then in that confusion, whether fixed dose combinations are a separate class or they're new drugs. Now, if they were new drugs, you didn't need separate regulations for fixed dose combinations. They would have been covered by new drugs. But we chose to have some special rules for fixed dose combinations. Sadly, this was all predictable. We know that we have a rampant use of FDCs. We have more FDCs than all the rest of the world put together has. They're completely irrational. There is no scientific basis for it. And yet we continue to use them in a manner that is quite scary. Now, where is the data for it? Clearly, there isn't. This matter has gone to the Supreme Court twice. The government constituted a committee, the Kokate Committee. They gave a report to say all of these drugs are effectively irrational. The drug companies then went to court and said, how can they be irrational? They've been working for 30 years. So that became the scientific basis for approval. The fact that they've been in use for 30 years, since 1983, was the cutoff. Then the Supreme Court said, no, have another committee look at it. So this ping pong has been going on for so many years that the value that we have of new legislation, which is the new clinical trial rules, has meant that nothing really has changed on the ground. The new clinical trial rules also deal with traditional medicine. And we've had a similar outcome there, where these rules were meant to ensure a convergence, really, of science, which meant that the standards that science sets for approval of drugs should be the same. You can't have a different scientific standard for modern medicine and a slightly different one for traditional medicine. Either it works or it doesn't. And it is beholden to whoever is seeking approval to establish the scientific basis of that. Now, what happened to that? Again, somebody went to the High Court. And those of you who are interested, some of these Ayurvedic medicines are not what you think they are. And two examples I'll give you are ENO, which is this just soda and nothing else. If you look at the label, it's an Ayurvedic medication. Now, I read a little bit of Sanskrit. I've read a little bit of the texts for Ayurveda. I couldn't find bicarbonate of soda, a Sanskrit word for bicarbonate of soda. The second one is this wonderful thing called Iodex. People of a particular, I think, age will remember it. Also an Ayurvedic product. Now, it's going to be very hard to find oil of wintergreen in any of the Ayurvedic texts. It is not even a herb that is found in India, the oil of wintergreen. So to think of these two as being Ayurvedic and being in existence for 30 or 40 years is a justification for it. And so we may have the new drug rules, the rules regarding new drugs. We may have an excellent definition of it, but we're not able to enforce anything. One of the aspects of it, as Milind mentioned, is coordination, which is that state drug regulators are issuing licenses, when in fact they should be a central function with a scientific basis. And we've seen that. So despite the central government notification in April last year, which insisted that all research, whether by traditional medicine or modern medicine, on the coronavirus has to be approved by the central government, and no claims will be made without approval of the central government. You had the announcement of Coronil as a cure. And you have to ask yourself, despite this notification, how is it that this product was actually approved by the state drug regulator? And after being approved by the state drug regulator and manufactured in bulk, how is it that two ministers of the central government were there promoting the drug? So then what happens to this notification of April 2020? What happens to the new clinical trial rules? Is it a new drug? Are Ayurvedic drugs excluded? These are all questions that we shouldn't be asking of ourselves. We shouldn't have to ask government any of these questions. And this tells us the problem that Dr. Swaminathan mentioned, which is how do you enforce it? What is the credibility of the regulator? It is these kind of approvals which undermines the credibility of the Indian drug regulator. No drug that's approved by the Indian drug regulator is going to get an automatic passporting into any other country. Whereas we're doing that for vaccines in this country, which is that if a vaccine is approved in certain countries around the world, which have sophisticated regulators, then they're automatically approved in India. It is for this reason of the Indian regulators' tardiness over the last few years that no other country in the world is willing to accept a drug that's approved in India for use in that part of the world. So I don't know what to say other than, we're letting ourselves down very, very badly as regulators and government.
Come in here, add in a few points.
Dinesh wanted to say something.
Yeah, no, I think you made my point anyway, but the two things that I wanted to say. One is that you've referred to this litigation that, went up to the Delhi High Court and they got a stay order at the Supreme Court. Now, there are law students and lawyers here. Think about it, right? As you said, many of these fixed dose combinations were approved by state drug regulators, not the central drug regulator, right? Yeah. So what was the litigation strategy to actually ask for a ban rather than saying, how did this approvals came about in the first place, right? If you pursued that litigation strategy, perhaps you've gotten a completely different outcome, because you've essentially given, the industry a big bag to beat you with, when you go down the litigation strategy. So, as law students, this matters, right? When you think about how you litigate, what litigation strategy that you pursue in the court, it matters, right? This is really, really important. That's what I wanted to say. The second point, I think it's interesting in the context of the point you're making, Murali, about the credibility of the regulator. I don't know how many of the participants today remember when AstraZeneca submitted the dossier for approval for the vaccine to the United States US FDA, the computation that they had done to arrive at the efficacy of that particular vaccine was different than what the dossier said. Yeah. Right? After the US FDA meeting happened, the agency actually came out and clarified that the number that the AZ had put out in public was not the correct number. The number was lower by a couple of different, 2 points or 3 points. I don't remember the exact number. 76, 79. The reason they did that was because they wanted to make sure that the companies were not taking advantage of the process to put something out there that actually is misleading, right? That's how you build credibility of the regulator. Now, remember what happened in our case. When itolizumab was approved, we didn't really know how it was approved, right? What was the legal basis for the approval of that drug? A bunch of us actually went to the company and asked and said, yep, on what basis did you get the approval? The company put misleading information out there, but then got corrected, right? Did the DCGI come out and correct that record? Not that I know of until today, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is that credibility of the regulator builds over a period of time, or multiple actions that you take, right? If you don't do that, you send a message that you're somehow colluding with the industry, which is not good for the country's drug regulator. You don't do that, right? These things matter.
Yep.
So.
Trust, we have to earn the trust, into the regulatory system. Yes, so I mean, if we do not have any pertinent issues that we are taking up at this time. I would just like to take it back to Surbhi to open up questions. I see there are some questions on the chat box so that the panelists could take some questions. But that was, I think, a wonderful discussion. I do see some queries on the chat box. Yes, so shall I open that to the panel? And we have here some. Surbhi?
Yes, Professor, that would be great.
I think we have here a question from Nandita.
We can't hear you.
How is it now?
It's better.
Well, we have a question from Nandita to Dr. Milind. Her question is about how can clinical trials ensure safety of drugs to consumers post-approval? How do we really need to look at the claims that companies are making in relation to trials? And what is this aspect of monitoring when we come to adverse events? How do we see this, the information that is coming out, which is so scarce, and is that also a reason why there is a hesitance, in relation to taking up the vaccine? Yeah,
Okay.
Dr. Milind.
Yeah, I'll just take it in general, then take it the hesitancy in taking vaccine. This is what we have been talking on poor communication. So when a drug comes out of clinical trial, so any drug that comes out into the market, I'm going very simplified, I'm not going at all very technical and very legal angle to it. So drug hits market, and as Murli mentioned, new drug especially, or drug gets approval through clinical trials. So it is phase 1, 2, 3 that has happened, and drug gets approved and gets some kind of a marketing authorization. Drug comes to market. There is a provision of post-marketing surveillance or phase 4 trial. Again, that is another big interpretational issue. I don't want to go into that. But there is a provision to understand and know how effective the drug that has been approved by the regulator post-clinical trial. There is a mechanism. But what you are saying on maybe API was not adequate or information was, that is where the disjointed mechanism, whether it is a central FDA or state FDA, really comes into picture. Having less quantity of API or some kind of the drug which got approval not being effective because of some content issue, that is where the spurious nature or a counterfeit, I'm slightly going ahead, that comes into picture. That is where again state FDA comes into picture. So to answer your question, yes, once drug is approved to go to market to be consumed by patient, there is a mechanism for sure of post-marketing surveillance or phase 4, which gives whether it is really effective the way they really claimed, or if there is some issues on drug not being effective because of constituents or composition problem, then the entire concept of spurious drug, etc., comes into picture. State FDA comes into picture. So there is a mechanism, but the challenge is how it is implemented. That is where the challenge is. Many times what happens, and recently we have seen a lot of claims being made by patients about drug being spurious or less effective. Very common in medical device sector. And last 3 days, Murli, we are representing 4 clients on oxygen concentrators, which are being sold just by putting the label and changing the label of. So that I don't want to go into that, but there is a mechanism. And to answer your question, why patients are not, rather patients being reluctant to take vaccine. One, of course, poor communication. And as we have been discussing, whether the data that was submitted, and Muri very rightly mentioned, are we still in phase 3 trial? Let me put it that way. Whether it is Covaxin or whether it is Covishield for that matter. And that is where the communication and not giving comfort, interestingly, by and large, talking to many of my doctor colleagues and people asking me from my office and friends and it is whether we should take vaccine or not. It is more of fear created by some nonsense sources. Pardon me, I'm using slightly wrong word, but the WhatsApp, university, social media, those ridiculous, stupid, counterfeit forwards that really played role. But coming back to law, there is a mechanism. If it is implemented properly, the point which you are raising can be taken care of. We can't hear you.
Another hello. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have another question from the audience. It's about what happens when you're in a threatened suit, particularly in this entire aspect of adverse events. And, then it is actually kind of shut up, kind of thing. So what happens to such scenarios in terms of compensation mechanisms? Can we really expect something happening if we are not going to be allowing those to be also taken note of?
So you mean it's to me?
In fact, they have not mentioned, but I think any one of you can take that.
When you want to take it, I will add it.
I think it's a follow-up from what Milind said. And I wanted to just say that there is a contrast between what happens in India and the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, if you sell a drug in the United States or in Europe, then you're expected to provide pharmacovigilance, which is information about complaints about the drug and the use of the drug globally. So let's take a simple case. You have paracetamol, which let's say company X is selling in the United Kingdom. You're expected to have data on everybody who's consuming your brand of paracetamol. After it is sold in the market, if there are any complaints, everything has to be documented. So even though you may have data about the drug that is being sold in the UK, because you're a manufacturer of that same drug in India and the rest of the world, the UK drug regulator expects you to provide data of this drug consumed elsewhere in the world as well. That is the level of data they're seeking. Whereas in India, if you want to find out any complaints on any drug, you try going to the website for pharmacovigilance, it has nothing. So it is very difficult for even doctors to understand what is this drug doing when it is used outside of the clinical trial mode. Now, that then feeds into, therefore, who can sue, who should be sued, on what basis. Patients don't have enough information, so they may have lost a dear one or they may have suffered injury themselves. If they knew that there are hundreds of others who suffered the same situation that they are in, and that information is available through pharmacovigilance, then they'll be able to make more substantial claims. There is an information asymmetry here. The patient doesn't know that there is a problem. The pharma company definitely knows there is a problem because it has all the data. The drug regulator may or may not know because it's not read the reports, the PV reports that periodically go to the drug regulator. So here you have three entities in this. One has all the information and knows a lot more than the others. The drug regulator should know, but doesn't do anything. And you have the patients who probably have the least information. Now, you can then imagine, how is it that a patient is going to be able to sue either for a tortious claim or a product liability claim in India, or even go under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act and sue in India? It is going to be really, really difficult to do if you don't have this data publicly available. So that is the reason we're not seeing a large number of claims in this country. This is the information asymmetry that exists that prevents people from making claims in this country. We've seen a lot of news coverage of these events. People have died after taking cough syrup, for example, but nobody's been held responsible. Nobody's paid compensation. So I think I have no great hopes that the legal system will help patients. It
has become an advantage point for many others, and that aches the entire healthcare system very badly. Well, there's just another question that we have, if we have time on this panel, just to look at the aspect of regarding efficacy of medicine and the role of regulatory bodies. Is that not a disputed matter when we look at de facto and de jure context? This is Kaushik Rawal asking this question.
Efficacy is a fact. Okay, so it is not about de facto, de jure. Either a drug is efficacious or it is not. Science will tell us. It is not a matter of opinion. We have understood efficacy very, very well. Even in complex products like biologics and vaccines, we understand efficacy very, very well. I think if you want to take a philosophical view, you can take a view that no two human bodies are the same, and therefore what works in one will not work in the other, and have these philosophical discussions. They're wonderful for writing an academic paper, but in the scientific world, we've set very good standards for measuring efficacy. So I wouldn't think of this as too much of an issue. I think the issue is likely to be that there are parameters, and Milind mentioned some of these to you, which is, what is the effective dose in a tablet, for example, and is there variation in that? What is the tolerance allowed for that? How does it deteriorate over time? Now, all of these are well understood concepts. So we know after 4 years, a paracetamol pill lying in your drawer, what is it likely to do? We know it. We have control samples. We have put them through all of these tests. They're real valuable source of information for us. So efficacy over time, we're able to understand. Efficacy in different kinds of populations, we're able to understand. We test for them. That is the whole purpose of clinical trials, that we look at whether there are differences in efficacy. And the requirement for local trials, in addition to the global trial, is a further way of ensuring that the variances that can happen between populations is now tested. We adjust for them and confirm that drugs that have passed global trials show the same efficacy in local populations. So the rules are very good. We have a good understanding for them in science, but also now in the rules.
Oh, agreed.
You want to add in a few points, Dr. Milind?
No, I think I totally agree with him.
Okay.
There's nothing beyond we can say on that.
Yeah. Surbi, do we have a time for another question? There is Bindu George who has just put in into the chat box.
Yes, Professor.
Okay. I think her question is very pertinent. She wants to know more about the role of judiciary in helping out from this entire mess, and also providing unbiased approach, which obviously the judiciary should be in, and will also help us. This burden that is there on the healthcare and the investment can hopefully be managed, or even we can lessen that. So she is asking us about the aspect of independent judiciary, and how should the judiciary be looking at this?
Well, so far the judiciary has deferred to the executive. The judiciary has no real competence and expertise in deciding these issues of science. Perhaps Justice Bhatt will not like me saying it, but if you look at the experts they've appointed to deal with the oxygen crisis, I can guarantee that none of them has the expertise to deal with supply chain issues in oxygen. They may be excellent doctors. They should be treating patients. I don't think they have a clue how to solve the oxygen crisis. It is not a problem that doctors are trained to solve. Milind may be a great ENT surgeon. I'm sure Dr. Trehan and Devi Shetty are outstanding surgeons. But to solve the problem of oxygen shortage and the supply chain issues is not really an area of their expertise. They're all well-meaning people. And so the role the judiciary can play is trying to intervene, if it does, in a manner that actually solves the problem. Making committees is a wonderful way of getting the executive off the hook. Have a committee, the committee reports, and then the executive says it will look at the committee's report, it will review the report, and then you have another round of litigation on the report itself. If the judiciary were to actually come down on this practice and say, we let science take the lead, these are not plain policy issues, appoint, if they have to, committees that are relevant to many of the issues that need to be discussed, then we will have solutions. So on the 2 or 3 cases that we mentioned, the cases in the Delhi High Court on this Ayurveda notification, the lead petitioner there is Reckitt Benckiser, the very well-known Ayurvedic company from the Vedas, right? So they are the lead petitioner in that. Now that matter has been pending since 2018. There's no reason that petition should have been allowed. We could have got rid of it in a week's time. The FTC matter has been going up and down for many, many years now. And effectively, the judiciary is refusing to answer the question. It's a very simple matter to answer, to say, provide us the data. The expert committee has looked at the data. It has said that there is no data. Therefore, no FTCs. Withdraw it from the market, junk it, we'll be done. So there are solutions there. And the judiciary can make a difference if it wants to. So this is just the 2 examples I've taken. The third example is misuse of skin products, especially skin whitening products and the like. There's a petition pending in the Delhi High Court for many, many years now. We've had dermatologists who have intervened and said, please ban these medicines. They are all available like beauty products. They are OTC products. Please ban them. Delhi High Court has done nothing. So 4 or 5 years on, that matter is pending. Activists are trying to move the matter, but nothing's happening. So if the judiciary wants to prioritize, it can prioritize these matters. It can have effective remedies. It doesn't have to go out to find these cases. These cases are in the court. So if the judiciary wants to fix it, it can fix it quite easily.
I totally echo what Murli just mentioned. And I think that it would be the greatest contribution to complete the pending cases related to healthcare. All across all, there are so many. He just mentioned 4 or 5, but if you give us some, for no reasons, they are being pending. And their involvement in present problem, I'm not sure whether it's going to give any result, honestly speaking, because everybody is confused. You formed a task force of ABC persons on oxygen crisis in Delhi, but same problem is there in Gujarat, same problem is there in UP, same problem is there in Karnataka, big time. So judiciary coming like this, and what they do end of the day, at the most they can be facilitator in providing solutions to make execution and implementation in the best possible way. That's what I personally feel. If there is no question, I have a question for Dinesh.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'll allow that, yes.
So I think, Dinesh, I just want to understand from you, that 2, 3 things which came out. That one is something is wrong, There are so many dots in implementation of law. I'm just referring to our topic only on clinical trials and new drug approval.
Sure.
It is implementation issue. I have seen huge problem with subject expert committees interpretation. I've gone through minutes and honestly, I did not get anything out of it. What made them give approval? What more made them not giving approval? And as I mentioned, left hand not knowing right hand not knowing what left hand is doing. What could be the solution? Because you are highly experienced here, you deal with, public policy, activism. There has to be some solution. And I tell you, if something doesn't happen, I always say that crisis brings an opportunity. First time, I think even government possibly say, public, there is no public health in India. Let me put it that way. There is no public health in India, I'm telling you. I used to receive patients of foreign body in bronchus and say, doctor, kuch bhi kar lo, main ghar bech dunga, lekin patient ko bachao. That doesn't happen in other countries. So something is amiss. Somehow these dots need to be connected to end of the day to make that affordability. I don't want to enter into that, But I personally feel the accessibility is the biggest problem. If you see today, access to oxygen, access to bed, access to proper care, access to right medications, what can be done? I honestly speaking.
Yeah, look, we can find 15 different things that are wrong, right? But I think we have to go back to first principles, first of all. Now, who assembles the SEC? Right? There must be somebody who says, okay, we invite you to be a member of SEC, right? Now imagine on the membership of the SEC, which was published after a long drawn out, RTI, how many people on that SEC actually have done drug development, right? So the point I'm trying to make to you is that Drugs and Cosmetics Act today does not require the DCGI to be a medical doctor or a public health person, right? That person doesn't need to have an MD or an MPH degree. What the law says is that the DCGI needs to have background in pharmaceutics, right? If you put a person like that in that role, that person's understanding and how the person will interpret something will be limited, right? That role is not a pharmaceutics role. DCGI is a public health role, right? You need an MD and PH in that role. The first thing that most, not just this DCGI, if you look back five previous DCGIs, their approach is anytime there is a problem, you go to AIIMS and pick 5 people, right? If you take a pediatrician from AIIMS and you make that person a member of your subject expert committee to approve a vaccine, what does it tell you? If you don't have a virologist, if you don't have an epidemiologist on that subject expert committee, you're going to get, a bunch of crap, sorry, right? So the answer to the question you're asking is, let's go back to our fundamental principles. Look at the Drugs and Cosmetics Act and ask whether the time that was written, this was 1940, before even we were independent, right?
Yes.
The medicines that were available at that point in time were all antibiotics. Yeah. We didn't have medicines for diabetes. We didn't have medicines for cancer. We didn't have medicines for aging. We had penicillin. Right? So we wrote the law based upon what was relevant at that point in time. We're going to be celebrating 75 years of our independence. Time to take a look at that law upside down, right? And find people who are qualified, right? If you are going to put together an expert committee to look at approval of an oncology drug, then you get C.S. Pramesh from Tata Memorial to be on your subject expert committee. If you are going to be approving a drug to treat sickle cell anemia, you're going to find somebody who has public health experience working in Chhattisgarh, where the disease prevalence is. You're not going to go to AIIMS and find Dr. Guleria to come and sit on your subject expert. Right? We have to think differently. We have to think broadly. There is no one size fits all solution to our problems, right? But that starts with finding somebody in that role who understands what that role is. That role is not a representative of the industry. Today, we are more concerned about ease of doing business than public health. That is not what that person's remit is. Ease of doing business is not the responsibility of the Drug Controller General of India.
Yeah.
Right? We've got our priorities all screwed up. So to answer the question you're asking, Milind, we need to go back to our Drugs and Cosmetics Act and look at fundamentally differently what we need to do, right? We still want to regulate our drug supply with a 1940s law. Doesn't work.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
We should stop, right? It's 1 o'clock.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I think it's 3:30 my time.
Yeah. For him, Dinesh, I think it's.
Good morning.
Good morning to early morning. Yes, to you. Okay, over to Surbhi. Thank you so much, all the panelists. It was wonderful to have your insights into this. And I do hope something comes out of this. And I go back to Milind on every crisis has an opportunity, and this opportunity should show us the light at the end of the tunnel. Back to Surbhi, yes.
Thank you, Professor. I think I speak on behalf of several of the attendees that it has been a privilege to be audience to this extremely nuanced and insightful session. As law students and citizens, we have sought to engage with several of the themes this panel spoke about, but this discussion has equipped us with not only the vocabulary of asking those questions, but with the right and better critical insight necessary to ask them. So thank you for so beautifully summarizing the clinical trial regime in India, comparing it to global best practices, but also bringing to the session normative standards of institutional interactions between regulators, between policymakers, the judiciary, medical professionals, pharmaceutical companies, and the citizenry. You also discussed several themes that have not received enough public attention, such as insurance for clinical trials, compensation in adverse events, accelerated approvals, credibility of drug regulators in India. So thanks once again to each of the panelists for leaving us richer with this discussion. A special gratitude to Professor Manchukanti for so effortlessly moderating and navigating the session, and to Mr. Dinesh for not only joining us in the wee hours, but constantly answering questions that the attendees have sent in the chat function. Dr. Milind and Mr. Murli, many thanks for your incisive analysis. We are also thankful to the audience for so actively engaging with our panelists today. So a very warm and wholehearted thank you to everyone who joined us today.